Good evening and welcome to the IISM West Midlands branch webinar that's obviously now taking place on the Zoom platform. As many of you will be aware, the webinar is one of many opportunities for recording CPD and development of personal skills. The IISM website will assist with further information on upcoming webinars that are taking place through the organisation, this and obviously other IISM branches. There are also other areas such as the IISM Member Resource Hub that can be utilised as and when convenient, which also contains a number of professional development webinars that have taken place over the last few months. This area is having information uploaded on a regular basis. Those that are following the IISM West Midlands branch LinkedIn page will be aware that efforts are made through regular posts to ensure that members, followers, are aware of events that are taking place and much more, such as the next webinar through IISM Yorkshire and Humber, which is on the 13th of June. This is a lunchtime webinar between 1 and 2 and is covering the financial risks of doing nothing. As we obviously at IISM look at various risk management areas. On the same day, you could also attend the Egypt branch webinar, who have a regular speaker, Andy Farrell, who will be looking at writing an investigation report. Whilst we would obviously all hope not to be or have an incident, the investigation element is an extremely important part of obviously learning. Can I please take this opportunity to congratulate those that were nominated as nominated finalists and of course the winners of the various awards at the IISM Risk Excellence Awards 2023. That took place on the 18th of May. Many of us go above and beyond expectations, but to win an award for this has to be the icing on top of the cake and a time to obviously celebrate. Credit should also be given to the number of main sponsors that obviously enabled this event to take place. Thank you to all those that obviously made the event possible. For those that have been following recent events, you may have seen IISM's President, Ruth Denyer, has had a busy schedule, speaking at various EHS events, for those that have had the pleasure of attending these in person or virtually. For this evening's webinar on fire safety management, we have Lauren Lee. Lauren's a fire service leader at Assurity Consulting, providing commercial and technical support to a team of consultants, as well as day-to-day managerial support to the consultancy services manager. Lauren's also service leader for fire safety management, positioned as the main point of contact. This involves developing, implementing and reviewing policies, procedures and report templates in line with legislative updates. We are grateful to Lauren for sparing the time to provide this webinar to members. As many will be aware, this is an area where there have been a number of changes recently that will definitely be keeping Lauren extremely busy. One example being registration of high-risk residential buildings with the building safety regulator. On the 23rd of May, around 750 applications had already been opened with the HSE. The HSE published that on the LinkedIn page. Finally, thank you to Greg Davies, IISM London, our networks manager Julie for assisting with this event, who will also be facilitating questions. Questions can be asked in the Q&A element or area of this particular platform, and you can also raise your hand using the chat function at the end of the webinar. Lauren will be more than happy to obviously answer where practicable, and obviously finally thank you to Lauren for presenting this webinar again. We're extremely again grateful for you sparing the time. Over to you, Lauren. Thank you.
Thank you, Tony. Evening, everyone. As Tony mentioned, I'm a consultancy services deputy manager at Assurity, and I also head up our fire safety services within the business. So the fact that you're all here attending this webinar means that you're already aware of the mountain of changes that have occurred recently in the fire industry. So my goal is to give you a brief overview of the changes, the Fire Safety Act, Building Safety Act, and then also what we expect to happen in time to come in the following months and years. hopefully give you a bit of an insight into what you should be doing already, how you can prepare as well. As I said, it will be brief. There is so much to cover. So, you know, I can only touch on so much in my allocated time today. So, more importantly, fundamental, we need to understanding of the RFSO, and importantly, the RFSO are going to have there are changes coming on the 1st of October. So the Regulatory Reform Fire Safety Order, I'm sure we're all aware of it now, came into force in 2006, and it replaced or repealed much of the fire safety legislation that was in place, and then just brought it all under one simple order. And it means that any person who has some control in a premises now must take reasonable steps to reduce the risk of fire. There are 5 parts to the RFSO, and then there are 53 articles within those. I'm not going to be covering all of them. We don't have time, and I'm sure it won't be that interesting. But I do want to touch on a couple of them and how they will be changing as well come the 1st of October. So Article 3 defines who the responsible person is. I'm sure we've all heard the term responsible person, but it's in relation to a workplace. So you as the employer, or if you have any extent of that workplace under your control, then you are the appointed responsible person when it comes to managing fire safety. That is not changing. That still remains the case. However, as you'll see later in my presentation, there are now additional duty holders that the responsible person needs to be aware of, and also must liaise with, share information, and cooperate and coordinate with each other. So the main duties of under the fire safety order, I'm sure we're all aware of, but this comes under part 2, and it's across articles 8 to 23. No, I haven't mentioned article 24 because I will come on to that a little bit later, but we are the responsible person must carry out a fire risk assessment. That's under article 9. Now, currently, you have to record your fire risk assessment if you have 5 or more employees. Come the 1st of October, that is being scrapped, shall we say, being removed, and you must record your fire risk assessment regardless of the amount of employees you have. We're also aware of we must provide fire safety training and awareness to our staff and visitors and contractors who attend our workplaces, produce fire emergency plans. So they might be on your fire action notices, your fire evacuation procedures, conducting fire evacuation drills as a means of practice, carrying out fire safety inspections of our workplace, make sure escape routes are kept clear and fire exits aren't blocked, and maintaining the fire safety equipment that we have present within our workplace. So that's your fire alarm system, servicing your fire extinguishers. Now, under part 3 is all about enforcement, and we're also seeing some more changes to this part come the 1st of October. So you may, hopefully, none of you have had any of these issued to you before, but there are 3 main types of notices that a fire officer can issue to you if they're not quite happy with the fire safety arrangements that you have. Now, this can be an alterations notice, which basically means that they want you to change something and you have to adhere to that, otherwise it would be an offence. An enforcement notice is where they believe you failed to comply with any provision of the Regulatory Reform Fire Safety Order. And a prohibition notice basically means stop what you're doing, whether that would be occupying a building, carrying out an event or an activity. Now, you'll notice that those are articles 29, 30 and 31. Article 27 is all about power of inspectors. So they are the local your fire and rescue service. They are the regulators on behalf of the RFSO. They are going to be given more power come the 1st of October. Now, there is a limit in terms of fine that you could be issued, and that's capped at £1,000. Come the 1st, that's going to be removed, and there'll be an unlimited fine. So you may think, well, the new changes in legislation all really apply to residential properties. That's not the case, because the RFSO also applies to our workplaces. So these alterations that are coming in October most likely are going to affect you if you are responsible for any part of your office, workplace, or building. So moving on to the Fire Safety Act, where did this all come about? Cast your minds back a few years now. Gosh, we're coming up to 6 years this month. Yep, we're in June. The Grenfell Tower tragedy. Dame Judith Hackett delivered an independent review of our building regulations and fire safety between 2017 and 2018. Now, the focus was on multi-occupied high-rise residential buildings. Fire safety legislation was minimal, if not non-existent, in comparison to commercial workplaces. So off the back of that review came the Fire Safety Act. So the RFSO previously only really focused on commercial property and workplaces, hence why this legislation doesn't extend to Northern Ireland or Scotland, because they both have their own fire safety legislation. So it's worth noting. So the Fire Safety Act is not only focused on the 4,000 high-rise residential buildings that we have across the country. It's now expected that we have 12,500 that fall into the scope of the Building Safety Act. But the Fire Safety Act captures all residential properties that contain 2 or more sets of domestic properties or residential units. So there could be as many as 1.7 million properties that fall under the catchment of this change. So all this does is it essentially extends the requirements of the RFSO into any property that has 2 or more residential units within it. So think about your building. You've got a retail shop on the ground floor, then you might have a couple of floors of office, and then you've got 2 flats on the top. That building now falls under the scope of this. It's got 2 or more residential units. And what it does now is it extends the requirements of the RFSO to the building structure and external walls. So that could be your doors, your balconies. We've all heard about external walls and cladding, solar panels, any common parts, as well as the doors between the domestic units, so the residential units, and the common parts. So if you look after any property or even occupy any property with 2 or more residential units within it, then your fire risk assessment now needs to capture those areas. So your structure, the doors, etc. I also wanted to draw your attention to this PAS document. So PAS 9980, it focuses on assessments called fire risk appraisals for external walls. It came into effect over a year ago now, but it's not designed for buildings under construction, because that's where the Building Safety Act comes in, and it's also not to be used to put blame on any historical building works. We're very good as a nation at panic buying. I think we all know the toilet paper scenario during COVID, but after Grenfell, there was a huge demand in external wall surveys to check whether there was combustible cladding. We don't have the resource to carry out all of those surveys. So this PAS document was kind of introduced to have a more sensible approach to be able to resource those needs to those who need them the most. So it's the methodology for analysing whether you need an external wall survey or not. It's not for you to carry out, but it's down to your fire risk assessor. Now, they don't have to be competent in external wall surveys or external walls at all. I'm not, and I'm a fire risk assessor. But when you're having your fire risk assessment done, the risk assessor should be looking at your property and external walls and thinking, well, what's the risk of external fire spread? If it's just a brick construction, there's no balconies, nothing attached to the external walls, then job done. You know, you're quite a low risk or low likelihood of fire spread. So they need to document that in your report and then move on. However, they can make recommendation for further investigation, which is like a basic wall assessment carried out by a specialist fire risk assessor if they feel that there's a medium risk. So there may be some just management recommendations made, but other than that, they might deem that the risk is deemed acceptable, and you've got all of that evidence now. Now, if the fire risk assessor thinks, okay, there's definitely cladding here, because it's not just what you can see, there's insulation panels and cavities behind what we can visually see, then they may make recommendation for you to have a more in-depth survey. When that survey is carried out, it will be quite intrusive. It's a bit like an asbestos survey. They'll drill a small hole, take out the material and send it away for testing, and then give you a full report of as to the combustibility and whether you've got suitable fire barriers within your cavities. So something to be aware of, and something to check that your fire risk assessor is capturing within your report. So moving on to Fire Safety England regulations. Now, this is where the height thresholds start to come in. These regulations came into force on the 23rd of January this year. So they've been in force for a couple of months now. As you can tell by the title, they apply to England only. But as I said, there is the height threshold. You will probably get quite bored of me saying 2 or more residential units, but this all applies to buildings of 2 or more residential units. So if you have a building with 2 or more residential units within it, and the building is at 18 metres in height or 7 or more stories, that doesn't include the ground floor, but the basement levels, sorry, then you must share electronically with your local fire and rescue service information regarding the external walls. So everything we've just spoken about, you'll collate all of that evidence, and we need to be sharing that with the local fire and rescue service. Every fire and rescue service has a different way as to how they want you to share that information. London Fire Brigade, I know, has a portal that they want you to register on, whereas West Sussex Fire and Rescue Service, they have an email address and they want you to share PDF copies. So it's a quick search on the internet, it's quite easy to do. But they also want to see floor plans, building plans of the building. So what do you have present, and what firefighting equipment is available for them to use. Take all of that information, and then you need hard copies. Now, we need a premises information box. The industry has always called it a premises information box, whereas these regulations call it a secure information box. I'm not quite sure why we couldn't agree on just one terminology, but if you hear either of those terms, they mean the same thing. You might have already seen them about some brands like girder boxes. Next time you're walking down the street, have a look, and you might see them on the side of the buildings. They've been there for years. Now, this is purely all of that information, hard copy in the box. So this is fantastic. Even if your building doesn't fall into scope of this, if your building is unsupervised, unmanned, no security of an evening, if a fire occurred overnight, there's not who's going to be there to assist the fire and rescue service. If there isn't anyone there immediately, provide this information and the fire and rescue service have it to hand. The National Fire Chiefs Council did create a code of practice as to what they should look like, where they should go, what should be in it. It's free and it's a really good PDF. I will show you some examples on the next slide. Also need to provide some wayfinding signage. Now, if your building was built over after 2020, this will already be in place because of it was integrated into approved document B updates. So that's the guidance document to follow on how to meet building regulations. This isn't the green directional signage that we're all used to. This is literally signage in the stairwell, in the lobby, outside a fire lift lobby that shows what floor you're on and what flat numbers are present on that floor. It needs to be quite visible in low light or smoky conditions. I often make recommendation for it anyway, because as someone who's not familiar with the surroundings of the building, it can be quite disorientating if you're walking down multiple sets of stairs and you don't know what floor you're on. And then the last one is to undertake monthly checks on all firefighting equipment. This is the equipment that's going to be used by a fire and rescue service. So firefighting lifts, evacuation lifts, smoke vents, and risers. That's the one. Now, this came in purely because this is there was a 65-year-old woman who was housed in Grenfell. Now, she was specifically housed in Grenfell because she had severe arthritis, so she couldn't actually negotiate steps, and the lift was there available for her to use. However, on the night of the fire, the lift was out of service, and unfortunately, she died on the 18th floor. So this is where this has all come from. All of these regulations are the recommendations made by Dame Judith Hackett, and all of these come under Article 24 of the RFSO. Remember earlier when I said, no, I'm not mentioning it. And that is the power to make additional regulations where needed. So this is an example snippet taken from the NFCC's Code of Practice for a premises information box. You might now recognise that big red sign. But on the left-hand side, I thought this was a really, really good schematic that we could incorporate into commercial offices as well. So the box on the left, that's a big block of flats. You've got the roof, plant room at the top, and then ground floor and a reception. Each square is a flat, and the two red boxes indicate that the occupiers of that flat cannot evacuate themselves. They need assistance. The orange ones indicate that they also need assistance, but they can self-evacuate, but just slower. There is no personal information on that whatsoever, so it's great from a GDPR perspective. But putting that in your premises information box means the fire and rescue service can easily identify who needs help. These are the monthly checks that I was referring to on the firefighting equipment. Really simple, easy checks. The lifts is a case of going into the lift, operating it, see if you can take it to the floor that you're requesting it to, the doors open, and then doing a random check on other landing controls so that no one else can call the lift from a random floor. Smoke control is just checking that the smoke vents activate when the fire alarm system is activated, and checking fire doors close upon activation of the fire alarm system. Dry and wet risers, so checking they're undamaged. If you've got cabinets, that the glazing's all fine, they're locked and secured, and the leather straps and padlocks are present if you have those installed. And the same with suppression system and evacuation alert system. So visual examination of the panels, making sure that they're in good working order. And there's nothing more to it, but you just need to record these checks if your building is 18 metres or 7 stories in height and has 2 or more residential units. So now we're dropping the height threshold to 11 metres. Fire doors, I think we're all sick to death of talking about fire doors, I'm sure, but it is now a legal requirement to undertake quarterly checks on all communal fire doors and then annual checks on the flat entrance doors. Please, please, please don't go out and get a third party to come and do a fire door survey. They will probably say that cannot confirm that this meets current standards. You have to replace them all. Here's a quotation for £100,000. The regulations, let me just show you here, state you do not need a specialist to carry out these checks. These checks are simple enough for the responsible person to carry out. And as you can see here, it's check their self-closing. So if they're a cupboard or a riser, they're locked shut. If that's, if it says fire door, keep shut or keep locked. Open the door fully, let go. Open the door to 15 degrees, let go. Does the fire door close fully within its frame? Check the frames for damage, the glazing for damage. Are the intumescent strips and cold smoke seals in good condition? And that's it. There's no need for a more detailed technical examination. That is written into these regulations. So please don't be scaremongered to have a competent service provider carry out these checks for you. And then the flat entrance doors are exactly the same. So you're doing the same checks, but you're just doing it on an annual basis. Now, there are protections for you as building managers. If tenants are not giving you access into the flats, they're actually prohibiting you from carrying out your legal duties. Therefore, you can obtain a court order against them. So by reporting them to the regulator, there are now contravention notices against residents for not providing access. And they are recommending that all new leases now include the right of this access to. And then dropping the height threshold again. So this is for all buildings with 2 or more residential units, regardless of height. So this is anything that falls under the Fire Safety Act. We need to be providing relevant fire safety instructions to residents. So how to report a fire, what to do when a fire has occurred. So this is based on the evacuation strategy. Is it stay put? Is it simultaneous? That sort of information. And also providing them with information on the importance of fire doors. So don't prop fire doors open, don't remove self-closing devices if they're going to change the locks to their flat entrance doors. That needs to meet the same fire resistance specification as the rest of the door. Don't drill holes, etc. This information needs to be provided to the resident as soon as possible after they moved in, and then on an annual basis going forward. There are a number of fact sheets on the government website regarding each of the regulations I've just spoken about. I don't know how long they'll be on the website for. I presume a little while yet, but they're quite good. They give a real prescriptive of what the requirements are. So onto the big one, Building Safety Act. This is a huge piece of legislation, and it's going to take some time for the whole thing to come into force. So this reached royal assent and became an Act of Parliament back in April last year. Now, it's not expected to be fully implemented until later this year. There are certain parts of the Act which are going to be coming into force at different periods, specifically 1st of October. Remember, the changes to the RFSO happen when the Building Safety Act comes into force, which is 1st of October. Now, really importantly here, the buildings in scope, remember, two or more residential units, but there is a height threshold here. So it's 18 metres or 7 stories high, whichever's reached first. Doesn't include basement levels. And there was a consultation last year as to what buildings should fall into scope. And then December, just before Christmas, the government made the decision not to include hospitals, care homes, prisons, hotels, military barracks, just for this period currently. It's likely they're going to come into scope at a later date, but I think because there are potentially 12,500 properties that are going to fall into the scope of this Act, we kind of want to focus our resources on those that actually really matter currently. So, you know, the residents, and then at a later date when we're fully up to speed with this, it's likely that those will come into scope. The Fire and Rescue Service have been lobbying for a reduction to 11 metres in height. They have been lobbying for that for years, so it's likely that that could change. But I wanted to include this because this is how to determine building height. It may sound silly as to how to determine building height, but it's not from the ground floor to the top of the building. This is defined now under new legislation called Higher Risk Buildings Descriptions and Supplementary Provisions Regulations 2023, real mouthful. That came into force on the 6th of April this year. So to determine building height as to whether your property falls into scope of any of this is from the ground floor, or if your property is on a hill, then it's the lowest part of that ground floor, up to the floor plate of the uppermost occupied story. So if you have plant rooms on the roof and you don't have anything else, you don't have a flat or an office, discount it because it's not occupied. So it'll be from the floor plate of the uppermost occupied story. That is how you determine your building height in meters, or 7 stories. Again, don't include basements, lower grounds, it's just ground to the uppermost story. That's how you determine building height. This is from the government website, by the way, this little diagram and this description. If you have any mezzanine floors, if the floor area of that mezzanine is over 50% of the rest of the floor area, then it counts as a story. So just worth knowing. So there are new roles and responsibilities that have come into play as part of this Building Safety Act. I think we're all aware and have heard of clients, principal designers, principal contractors as part of CDM regulations. They're still in place, but they now have additional duties as part of the process for getting a building through the Building Safety Act requirements. And it also just means that there's really nowhere to hide, and you're all now classed as duty holders and have duty to make sure that that building is safe and residents are safe. Now, one of the most important duty holders, and this is brand new, is a term called accountable person. So this is in addition to a responsible person under the RFSO. So this is essentially the organisation who owns or has responsibility for a building. It is the organisation, but then you must have a point of contact who's acting on behalf of that organisation, who will liaise with the building safety regulator. If there is multiple accountable persons within a property, similar to how you'd have multiple responsible persons, then the organisation who owns or has responsibility for the structure of that building, they are known as the principal accountable person. Really, really important term. PAP, PAP, lots of people use different terms for it, but principal accountable person is the main structure, responsible for the structure. And then you'll have an accountable persons who may be responsible for common parts, or you might occupy the office part of the building, and then you've got residents on the top. So it's really important to note that when a building is also being refurbished, this may involve both or multiple duty holders, because you might have only a part of a building that's being refurbed. You might have a principal designer, principal contractor, but then you'll have an accountable person because the building remains occupied during the refurbishment. So it's something to be aware of. There are multiple duties now that fall under the accountable person. Now, they must take all reasonable steps to prevent a building safety risk from happening. Now, building safety risk is legally defined as the spread of fire and or structural failure. And then reduce the seriousness of that incident if one occurs. So they also must register the existing buildings with the building safety regulator. Registration opened on the 12th of April. Tony mentioned earlier that there were 750 applications already, which is good. Not quite as many as 12,500. I think we'll see a real push in September. But they must register all buildings that fall into scope by the 1st of October. So by the 30th of September, because if you haven't registered a building that falls into scope and the building's occupied, as soon as the 1st of October rolls round, you've committed an offence, and there's sentences up to 2 years in prison for breaches of the Building Safety Act. So the Building Safety Regulator is a separate department of the HSE, and they are going to be the regulators for all high-rise buildings. So that's from every stage, all the way from design, all the way through to occupation. They are the regulators for high-rise buildings. The accountable person needs to also create a safety case report for the building. So once you've registered, it's on an online portal. It costs £251 per building. That needs to be done by 30th of September. There is then some key building information, which the principal accountable person must submit via the same portal by October. That part of the portal hasn't even gone live yet. We're promised it's coming out in September, but there's an awful lot of information that needs to be gathered and submitted. So I better get a wriggle on that one. And then from April next year, the Building Safety Regulator will start inviting principal accountable persons to apply for a building assessment certificate. As you can imagine, the assessment to get a building assessment certificate is going to take some time for each property, and there's approximately 12,500. They think there could be more. So they have 5 years to carry out these assessments, and they're going to focus on the tallest buildings first, the ones with the most dwellings, etc. So you could be called up on day one, or you could be called up in April 2029. So there's a lot of preparation that needs to take place. As part of this, you must develop a resident engagement strategy, which must include a complaints procedure as well, which allows residents to go to the Building Safety Regulator, and arrangements for sharing key information with residents. So the real message here was to try and get the residents, allow them to have a larger voice. All information must be maintained online as part of the golden thread. It's got to be digital. That's now going to be, it's a legal requirement. They were creating a building safety manager role, but that was scrapped because they didn't want residents to be charged for the appointment of an additional person. So only the Building Safety Regulator may transfer the accountable person accountability under the building assessment certificate, or they may replace them under special measures. So it might be where they feel that the current accountable person is not quite capable or competent, and they will temporarily replace them with a member of the BSR. As you can imagine, there's lots regarding competence at the moment. So there's a couple of PAS documents that came out for principal designers, principal contractors. The building safety manager was scrapped, and it's being developed as accountable person instead. Also, in terms of building control, there is a huge overhaul in terms of building control authority, competence. From April, there'll be a register that opens. Any building control officer will have to register, they have to sit exams, and they will all be managed by the Building Safety Regulator. As I said, all information must be stored digitally. So I think we've all seen it where a building changes hands and there's no information that came with it. Either maintenance contractors have taken logbooks away with them, can't find any historical information. This is to try and prevent that from happening going forward. So the golden thread needs to have all the information you use to manage a building needs to be stored here. It must be accessible by the building safety regulator. And there was a lot of talk about a certain single system being used. I think it was BIM format or an ISO format. And there was a whole British standard that came out on it. It was one of the most boring reads I've had to endure. So I don't recommend it, but it kind of talks quite common sense, you know, the information we use, how often it changes hands. So design, specs, you know, construction, materials, fire risk assessments, fire strategies, incident plans, fire evacuation procedures, maintenance records. We have all of that. It's just a case of how can we put it all online in a digital format so that it's easily accessible. So there's no need to go down a specific route in terms of like a platform. I'm sure a lot of you may already have compliance platforms in place already. If you have a very minimal or low risk property, then maybe just your shared drive and a couple of Word documents or Excel spreadsheets might be fine. It's just got to allow for authorised access to view, so by your risk assessor or the building safety regulator, and prevent unauthorised access as well. So I'm not going to go through all of these, but I've kind of touched on them already, you know, some organisational requirements, so your policies, procedures, your responsibilities, your continuity plans, responsibilities matrix, asset management, so your fire strategy, historic fire incidents, trend analysis, fire risk assessment and audit findings, and construction materials. If you're managing a project, so the strategic objectives for that project, how it's being managed, the fire safety responsibilities matrix for the project, so who needs to be consulted, and then when you're exchanging information as well, so who's going to take on that role, and you know, even down to filing of information. Where's it going to be filed? What's it going to be named? As I've included a couple of tips here, as a fire risk assessor, especially since the pandemic, I get an awful lot of information sent to me via email after the assessment. Some of these documents that come through, they're all just letters and numbers. So I have absolutely no idea how anyone knows what they are. So rather than calling something fire resistant, fireproof, compartmentation, fire stopping, try and pick a single set of terms and keep it all consistent. So if you typed in fire stopping or compartmentation, everything relating to that will come up. Try and avoid duplication of information. So, you know, don't file things in multiple places. Especially if it's an updatable document, because then you have to update it multiple places. Digitize everything, so scan it in if someone gives you a hard copy, and develop maybe like a responsibility matrix, so who's consulted, informed, who takes on this responsibility of filing it where they want it to be filed. And then what's the escalation procedure for sharing information, similar to how you would maybe a Legionella detection contingency procedure. So moving on to the gateway system, I'm going to touch on this quite briefly, but there are 3 main gateways as part of the Building Safety Act and a building's life cycle. The Building Safety Regulator is the only person, I say person, entity, that will allow for progression through those gateways. So it's regulated by the Building Safety Regulator, and they will only allow you to progress once they're happy with the information provided in the golden thread. So Gateway 1, so this is pretty much the planning permission stage. This is going to be a fire statement So the emergency arrangements for evacuation, also what facilities are in place for the fire and rescue service during the planning stage. They must need to know the name of the accountable person right there and then. Remember, this is the organisation, and then you'll have someone who's the point of contact, shall we say. And then this is achieved and developed with the accountable person by the principal designer. Then we move to Gateway 2. So this replaces that building control deposit of plan stage. This is before building works start. This is the providing of plans, proposals with compliance with building regulations, and demonstrating duty holder competence. Now, competence is a huge topic at the moment, especially even with fire risk assessors, but no one can seem to make a decision. The industry have their ideas, the government have their ideas. We need to merge and come together. But now there's a load of competency schemes out there. The industry is kind of pushing for it. We see a lot of customers and clients asking for confirmation whether you're third party accredited. It will be written into law at some point as part of the changes for the RFSO, but until that's actually agreed upon, that's being paused in the RFSO. And then Gateway 3, so this is at the end of the project, but before occupation. So this is the registration of the building with the building safety regulator. Remember the £251 registration fee. And this is key information, declaration of compliance with building regs. So that's normally issued by building control. And then it's a confirmation of the handover of the as-built building safety information. This needs to be a signed statement really from the accountable person to say that they've received everything. I know that sounds quite scary, but the accountable person is going to be involved right from the get-go, including the building safety regulator. So you're going to be very, very confident by them that, yes, I've got everything. I know my building risks. I know how it's been built, the construction materials, etc. So the building safety case, I've put and report in brackets here. Building safety case is what you're doing to manage your building. And that's how you're managing the risk of fire spread and structural safety of your building. That's what we all do from a day-to-day basis. The report is the narrative of that. I've been doing quite a lot of work with some of our customers and internally about what a building safety case report is going to look like. It's going to be long, it's going to be quite tedious and arduous, but this is a huge part of the applying for a building assessment certificate. If, as part of that building assessment certificate review by the building safety regulator, if they're not happy that you've met your legal duties with your building safety case report, your mandatory occurrence reporting, your residents engagement strategy, then they cannot issue you a safety certificate. No certificate you cannot occupy. So you can't reach that over the Gateway 3 process. That's for new buildings, or if you've had a full refurb and you're just about to occupy. For existing buildings, there is a process of, no, we can't issue a certificate at the moment, you've got to do X, Y, Z. Then you might have to reapply and join the queue of all the other applications that are waiting, or they might give you a prompt remedy. So everything looks fine, but can you provide us with this in 21 days? If you do that, they issue with a certificate. And that now must be displayed within the building in a prominent location so visitors and residents can see it. They've been very, very clear not to expect a template from the building safety regulator. They have repeated it time and time again. They have provided with some headings and some information on the HSE website about form and content. There's a lot of it. And it's a case of kind of taking it step by step and piece by piece, but it's providing a summary of everything you do and why you do it that way, you know, your control measures. It's got to be document controlled, and they will issue you with a registration number, unique reference number when you register your building. And it needs to capture all your relevant persons, your main risks from a structural point of view, a fire safety point of view, and then capture all your mandatory occurrence reporting, your residents engagement strategy, your complaints procedure. And that will be provided to the building safety regulator. So I did just also want to touch on some other aspects of the Act that might be of interest to you, because you're probably thinking, oh my gosh, this is going to cost a fortune. Well, the government have identified there is going to be a cost associated with some of these new duties, and some of them can be passed on to leaseholders through service charges. And these are known as building safety charges. This cannot include historical remediation costs, which must be paid by developers and landlords. Secretary of State issued a legally binding contract to all developers in the UK back in March. And if they didn't sign it, they are not allowed to develop any properties within the country, cross country. Last time I checked was about 2 weeks ago, and all had signed it bar 3. You can literally go online and find out who signed it and who hasn't. But as soon as they sign that, they are immediately responsible for carrying out any historical remediation costs back 30 years. So it's a tough contract to sign, but something needed to happen. I don't think there was ever going to be a solution where everyone was happy, but if they didn't sign it, then it would have fallen down to the residents. So there are statutory protections for leaseholders. So if this is something that you're interested in knowing a little bit more about, go visit the government website. There's, again, some handy fact sheets there. And then I mentioned earlier that this doesn't apply to everywhere, but it does have an impact on Scotland and Northern Ireland. They have their own fire safety legislation, very, very similar to the RFSO, but they do have their own. So for example, Garnock Court Tower block, 1999, I want to say, in Scotland, that resulted in them improving their fire safety regulations back in 2005. So they already had in place, it was mandatory for builders to ensure any external cladding inhibited fire spreading. So that was already written in there. Whereas in comparison, back in 2017, we had over 450 residential buildings, over 18 metres tall, with the same cladding that Grenfell Tower had. So the Act has introduced a new rights of action in relation to construction products in Scotland. So there's a new clause regarding liability related to construction products. And then the Act is also proposing to amend the Scottish law of prescription and limitation. So these are essentially the time limits for raising actions, and then preventing newly created claims from being fine barred. There's quite an extension actually. I think it's run from 15 years now for general construction products and 30 years for cladding products. So it's quite extensive. And then there's a new cause of action allowing anyone with a right of interest in a dwelling, so for example, its current owners, to bring a claim against the party in breach. There'll be a new homes ombudsman scheme. So this is also applicable in Northern Ireland and makes amendments to the Architects Act. So this is regarding discipline, CPD and appeal committees. Again, extends to Northern Ireland as well. So as I said, not directly applicable, but still has knock-on effects and consequences. So yes, that's a bit of a whirlwind, I appreciate. So sorry for the overloading of information, but I'm sure we could talk about it all week. But more than happy to take any questions if there are any.
Thank you, Lauren. That was brilliant as usual. We're still amazed how you managed to fit everything into such a short amount of time. We do have some questions today. Yep. So the first question is, for fire door doors checks / examination, does the responsible person need to have any qualification?
No, you don't. It's really, really simple check, you know, opening a door, checking for damage. I've always said, if you've already had a fire door survey carried out, because I know there was a huge influx in them, use that as your baseline. So you know what it looked like and whether it's acceptable a year ago. Has it changed? Has it deteriorated? So you can use that. But no, you don't need to have any qualifications.
Great, thank you. So the next question is, Lauren, from what you were seeing, I'll let you have a drink. I'll read it more slowly so you can have a drink. Lauren, from what you were seeing, which areas are causing APs the most difficulty?
Collating historical information. I think that was to be expected. Everyone's really panicking about, well, you've asked for historical information on, you know, how the building's changed since it was constructed. Well, this building's 80 years old or 100 years old or whatever. I don't have that information. So the building safety regulator keep saying, we appreciate that you're not going to be able to find every single piece of information. So what they're suggesting is, well, think about the impact of not having that information. Does it have a direct impact to the risk of injury or death of your residents or neighbouring property? If yes, then you should probably carry out a survey of whatever it is to try and find that information out now. Yes, it's going to have a cost to it, but you only really need to do it once. If it's not, then just document your decision why. Well, I don't think that's a key priority at the moment, and it's not going to have a knock-on effect to someone's health or death or injury. But yeah, that's a huge one at the moment.
Thank you for that, Lauren. Now, I'm not sure about this question because I'm not sure when it was asked. I don't currently fall into scope. Is this likely to change, and what should I be thinking of doing?
It depends on how you don't fall into scope. For the time being, I think this is going to be it for the next 5 years, because the building safety regulator have 5 years to carry out every building assessment certificate and all of the assessments of each property. They're estimating there's 12,500. There could be more. We won't know until the 1st of October when everyone's registered. Then I think we'll start seeing the hotels coming in, prisons, army barracks, that sort of stuff. But by no means it's likely that in 10, 15 years, this could apply to commercial property. If you actually think about the requirements, yes, it's an awful lot, but a lot of it makes sense about having a residents engagement strategy and knowing what your building's made of and holding everything online so nothing gets lost. You know, they're all quite sensible approaches. So I think we might see it creep into commercial property, but I think that might be best practice.
Okay, thank you. And then we've got another question here. So this is about hospitals and care homes. With hospitals and care homes being in scope, can you see any consequences or extra impact for these types of buildings above and beyond the current guidance?
I can see some consequences across the board, really, sometimes. The hospitals and care homes apply at construction at the moment, so not only at the construction phase. So once it's occupied, it's no longer in scope currently. So it will be the whole gateway process. So they're meant to be built in a safer way. But I know I was having a conversation the other day, a couple of hospitals, you know, they're subsiding. So half of it's not even in use because of its sinking. If it doesn't reach the height threshold, then the hospitals or care homes don't fall into scope. So there is still that height threshold.
Great, thank you. We had some difficult questions tonight.
Okay.
Okay, so I don't have a direct question about your presentation, but somebody's asked if they can have a copy of your presentation. No, if you don't feel comfortable doing that,
Fine.
Is that okay? I'm not sure if it's updated since she
Yeah.
last sent me a copy, but I don't think it has. So let me just make a note of the person who asked me for that. Okay. So I don't have, oh, I just had another question come in. Just bear with. Have you got time for one more?
Yeah, Tony's also got his hand up.
Oh, okay. I can't see that. There must be on a different. Let me ask this question first. So at the moment, it appears the only way to register a HRRB with the regulator is by using a credit card. Is there any other way of making the payment?
Not currently, unfortunately, no. Yeah, that's a bit of a tricky one. A couple of my customers have said the same thing. They can only issue POs. They don't have a company credit/debit card. That is the only way you can register at the moment. So find someone who can do it for you and agree a payment service of some sort. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, everybody who's asked for a copy of the presentation, I should be able to download these from the chat. But if you don't receive it, if you just want to email me at branches@rrsm.org, and I will send you a copy. So I think that's everything for this evening. Thank you so much, Lauren, for giving up your valuable evening to present to the West Midlands branch. We've got lots of comments saying, thank you so much, fantastic presentation, thank you. So I think everybody found it really useful. I just wanted to remind everyone that now we've moved over onto the Zoom platform, we will no longer be able to provide attendance certificate, so apologies for that, but hopefully this won't deter you from attending the next webinar. So as usual, the recording will be uploaded onto the RRSM YouTube channel in the next day or two. So I'd like to thank everyone for coming. I'd like to thank Lauren yet again for giving up your time, and we'll see you at the next RRSM branch webinar. Good night, everyone.
Thanks for having me.
Welcome.